My name is Yusuf Mahmoud. I am part-time senior advisor here at the International Peace Institute. And it's my pleasure and honor to be the moderator of this event, Multinational Rotation Contribution for UN Peacekeeping Operations. It even has an acronym, if you believe it, MRC. Don't confuse it with the rebel movement in Eastern Congo. What we are talking about is an innovative approach for ensuring that peacekeeping missions have the required critical enablers or capabilities to do their job. This approach, spearheaded by Norway, is designed to complement traditional force generation for UN peacekeeping operations. It has its middle name rotational because after Norway, Portugal will take over or has taken over or is indeed, and then Denmark, Sweden, and Belgium. The report that will be presented to you today and discussed and commented upon, it tries to draw early lessons from the MRC experiment in MINUSMA, Mali, and makes recommendations for making this experiment work and even work better. I read the report and I found it quite informative and insightful, and a little bit jealous, to be frank with you, as a former special representative. So I will touch upon a couple of things when we have our panel. But we are honored and indeed very pleased to have with us the Norwegian Minister of Defense, Her Excellency Ms. Eni Eriksen Søreide. I am doubly pleased because the panel we have assembled, despite all our efforts, is all male. And we have a female defense minister. I think we need to have more and more female defense minister with the hope that one day we will manage to desecuritize peace, or at least demilitarize it. So without further ado, I'm going to ask Her Excellency to come to the podium. Once we have listened to her, then I will join the panel at this table here. Excellency, you have the floor.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I'm very glad to see such a great turnout here today. But I do also have a feeling that when the warmth is so enormous outside, the air-conditioned localities could also be a nice way of spending the afternoon. I would like to start off by thanking the Norwegian Institute of International Affairs, NUPI, and also International Peace Institute, IPI, for having delivered such a very solid report, even though it is, as Mahmoud mentioned, it is early lessons drawn from the rotational force. It's a very important topic, and I've been having discussions today with some of the ambassadors in the UN on how we can modernize and reform US peacekeeping operations. And of course, there are many issues that are on the table, but how to generate forces being absolutely one of them. And I think we need to think differently about how this is being done, and the report and also the rotational contribution can be a way forward in this regard. And I would also like to congratulate with having given birth to a new acronym. That is something in the defense sector, at least, everything is acronyms. We don't know how to speak in normal wording anymore. We only have 3-letter acronyms for almost everything. NUPI and IPI has really played a prominent role in pushing the reform process forward, and not least by supporting the HIPPO panel. That has been very important, and I think that work needs to continue at the same pace, or even a more steady pace than up until now. But by doing so, we have been able to facilitate the important and also ongoing public debate on security and military affairs. And that is also why Norway has been supporting NUPI and IPI and why we have developed this great relationship and also resulting in this report. Small countries like Norway are dependent on finding smart solutions for UN deployments. We may be small, but we can pack considerable punch within certain niche capabilities when we cooperate with other countries. And believe me, there are many countries in Europe that are in the same position as we are, needing to find smart ways of doing things in order to contribute. In NATO, we seek this cooperation through initiatives called Smart Defense. And I think it's about time we start talking about smart peacekeeping. And for Norway, for example, it makes very much sense to cooperate closely with our Nordic neighbors. We have been doing so in operations for years. And this is also somewhere that we can capitalize on that solid experience from working together in other operations. And that was actually the starting point for us starting to play with the idea of a rotational contribution when it came to transport aircraft. And I would say it is definitely smart peacekeeping as we see it. We're a small, high-cost nation. We do not have thousands of soldiers to deploy, be it to the UN, to NATO, to coalition operations, so we have to think differently about our contributions. We do, however, have technology. We do have niche capabilities that really can make a difference on the ground. We need UN peace operations to work, and we need them to work better. And while recognizing that crucial role these operations can play, we must also realize that our expectations sometimes and also the demands, they are exceeding what peacekeeping can actually do. And we must also acknowledge that quantity, that we always discuss, is not enough. We have to start discussing quality. What is our contribution when it comes to situational understanding, to training and personnel, and to equipment? UN peacekeeping efforts cannot be based solely on which capabilities that we can offer, but also what the operations need. So I'm very pleased to see that the new Secretary General has taken many of these reform agendas and initiatives forward, and I have quite a distinct hope that this will also give results. Norway has been very vocal in sharing the Secretary General's vision for reform and for the UN. And we definitely welcome his initiative to strengthen the pillar of peace and security of the UN. And that is also in line, of course, with the recommendations from the HIPPO panel. The member states have to work together with the Secretary General in order to make this happen. He is not able to do it alone. Countries are not able to do it alone. We have to work together if we want real results and real change to happen. We must do it rapidly, decisively, and we have to have an open mind to new solutions. And I would say that in my experience, there is no lack of ideas, but there may be a lack of ability to implement and to put them into working. One reform area where the UN urgently needs to do better is in regard to safety and security of our personnel. On the 13th of July, in 1948, Ole Helge Bakke was a Norwegian serving in the UN mission in Jerusalem. He was shot by a sniper. He became the first UN peacekeeper to be killed in the line of duty. And today, 69 years later, we have about 3,000 UN peacekeepers who have lost their lives. Very few of them have been Norwegians. But in Mali alone, around 80 peacekeepers have lost their lives. And when we deploy peacekeepers into some of the most demanding and hazardous conflicts on Earth, we need to protect them so they can protect others. The situation in South Sudan nowadays is a stark reminder of that. And in that regard, military transport aircraft is a small but very important contribution to improving security of UN personnel. In the case of Mali and MINUSMA, they provide MINUSMA with a capability that makes the operation less dependent on the very risky roads and the risky desert, and we are able to fly in shorter time and deliver what we need to deliver in the operation. I've been visiting them myself, and I was quite impressed by all the work that is being done. And I will just shortly give you a couple of figures to show you how much one transport aircraft can mean in an operation like this. Coming back to the HIPAA reforms, providing force commanders with full tasking authority of all military capabilities is also key to improve operational effectiveness, but also to strengthen the security of UN personnel. This includes the use of key capabilities such as tactical airlift, helicopters, medevac, when the mission's concept requires this to happen, and also in order to respond in a timely manner to crisis and a situation or an accident. But when it comes to implementing reforms, money and resources matters. It will require compromises. We have to think differently, and we have to allow some new thoughts into this. Norway will never be able to contribute the quantity, but we can contribute quality. We can contribute with niche capabilities and focus on enablers. They, in a way, represent reform by themselves. And that is why we contributed in establishing the ASIFU unit also in Mali. And we have initiated the MRC, which we all now know what means, for military aircrafts. These pilots are force multipliers, and they are good examples of how Western countries and countries of not such a big size can contribute to modernizing US peacekeeping through innovative operational deliveries. So what were we thinking when we started this initiative? Well, in 2016, we saw how the UN struggled to give a sustainable delivery of transport aircraft into MINUSMA. We had been present since January. We were to end our term in November, so we had a 10-month term, which is quite a long term for a military aircraft from one single country in an operation. But we thought that just leaving the MINUSMA operation was not a very good idea without making sure that someone could be there after us. The reasons were two. First and foremost, the transport aircraft were needed. We saw it as a critical capability for actually keeping the operation itself going. And secondly, we had put a lot of emphasis, a lot of resources, work, money, and personnel into standing up the camp. So we thought, is there anything we can do to try to get other countries that we know have the same type of aircraft, who would like to contribute in UN operations, to say, well, yes, this is a good idea. So we started working with our Nordic neighbors. I remember where, I remember when. We were on board a Swedish frigate with a Nordic ministerial meeting in Sweden. And in one of the breaks between two sessions, we started just silently talking about this. Can we do something here? And it was, I would say, immediate interest. And one of the interesting things was that we were able to get countries to contribute in, I would say, a record time. And I think one of the main reasons for doing that was that, one, we have pre-existing relations. We know that we can work together. We had more or less the same aircraft. And I would also mention that when we said we can continue running the camp when other nations come in, that was maybe some of the things or some of the issues that made it easier for countries to contribute. As smaller countries, when we have contributions and we deploy to be it UN operations, NATO operations for our part, or coalition operations, one of the trickiest things is always that you need such a big support organization in order to be there. You need camps, you need personnel, you need intelligence, you need medical assistance. And to do that many places at the same time is an extremely big undertaking for small countries. So that is why we thought, well, we continue to run the camp. Countries do not have to stand up and take down again a camp every 6 months. That is not a good way of using resources. So instead we did it once, and now countries are coming in the fashion that was mentioned here. Nowadays, I think Denmark is taking over for Portugal, I think in a week or two, and the rotation will just continue. One of the other issues that we saw was very critical, and that I think also that we also have been talking about for a long time, is that it created a predictability along two lines. First, for the UN, they now have predictable delivery of transport aircraft to a UN mission until the end of 2018. We are looking into now if there are ways of extending this, but this is only, for now, something that we are discussing also with the other countries. But the other line was that we find it more predictable. One of the issues with UN operations is always that you know at some point when to deploy, but you never know when to end the mission. So telling countries that you deploy in May and you redeploy in November created that predictability that made it possible for countries to plan that, okay, in 2018, we have the possibility of being here for 6 months. And that's why we could also generate more countries. I think, however, that we should not limit ourselves to talk about these rotational contributions only when it comes to transport aircraft. There are a lot of other capabilities that we can do this that can be provided in the same manner. And I would just leave you with some figures to underline how important this contribution was. For our 10 months in the operation in Mali, we contributed 850 flight hours, 182 missions, 14,000 personnel, 600 tons of cargo, 15 medevacs with 20 patients. And that's quite a lot for one plane and one crew. But it also speaks volumes of how important that capability is in UN operations. So with those small thoughts, I would just like to once again say I'm very glad that so many people showed up, and I'm looking forward to hearing the panel discussing the report. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister. I admire the ease with which you gave us those numbers, but I retain other important points, which is the rationale behind this innovation and what makes the R possible. These are really very helpful to understand the components. As I have mentioned now, we are going to go and invite our panelists to join me. You have not only the bio of the minister, but you also have the bio of all our speakers. We have sent a message to ask them to please only speak for 5 minutes. If you see me going into epilepsy, you will understand why I'm getting impatient, because we are had to curtail it because some of our speakers have a busy schedule, so we'll finish at 2:15. Without further ado, I will ask them to join me at the podium. As I mentioned to you, I read this report that will be presented to us with great interest. And I reflected upon it from 2 perspectives. One as a former SRSG, but more importantly, as a former member of the high-level independent panel on peace operation. And whenever we discussed technical and logistical issues, we ask 2 questions before those recommendations, and we're not always successful in conveying that. One, what does this have to do with peace? And 2, what does it mean for the ordinary Malian, for the ordinary Central African, for the ordinary citizen? So I would like, if it is possible, for our panelists to maybe share their thoughts on the multiplier effect of this innovation for these 2 entities: peace and people. As you remember, the report has 3 Ps, that's 2 of them. The other one, that sort of recommendation that really struck my attention, and I basically lived it when I was deployed in Chad and Central African Republic, is recommendation number 6, which I will read to you. And it basically says attitude matters. And it's basically talking about that whatever the capability deficits or the capability answers, we must address it as a whole mission, or a whole, not civilian and military. But more importantly, we should find a way of avoid any symbols that distract us from that unity of spirit and attitude. And the fact that this particular airplane, C-34, 130, what is it?
C-130.
C-130, there are many other 30s in it, is green and the rest of the fleet is white, pose a question. Certainly it posed the question for me when I have inherited from U4 the Irish contingent that kept its aircraft green and then just splashed in black the UN on it. It had generated a lot of questions, was not always successful in answering them. And so there are far more important, excellent recommendations. This is just the one that really attracted my attention. So without further ado, I would like to start by asking one of the co-authors of the report, Mr. Butelis, to start us off. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you very much, Youssef. So I'll try to be brief and present sort of the main points in the report, but there are copies of the reports outside, so I invite all of you to pick them up on the way out. So I think, as it was mentioned already, the study was generally funded by the Norway MOD, but it was an independent study carried out by NUPI and IPI jointly, and we take full responsibility for the conclusions and the recommendations, which are our own. There are many types of partnerships when you're talking about peacekeeping. You've probably heard of triangular partnerships, UN African Union partnerships, and combined deployments, etc. Today we're talking about another kind of partnership, which is the MRC, where about member states, troop contributing countries get together to contribute a capability to a UN mission over a period of time. For this study, John Karlsrud from NUPI and myself carried out interviews in the capitals of the members of the MRC, as well as in the mission itself in MINUSMA back in February. We also held consultations here in New York with a number of the TCCs. So, as the minister mentioned in her keynote, this is really an early lessons learned study, but we all felt, I think, that it was important to sort of promote already this innovation, as it might be helpful for other kind of capabilities and more broadly for fourth generation in the UN. I'm sure follow-on study could raise more issues down the road, but so take it as an early lessons learned. So first of all, I won't go back into the story of why and how it came about. That was, I think, already told. But I think it's interesting to note that there had been different C-130 planes in MINUSMA prior to the MRC, but that capability was discontinued at different points. There were gaps in between the contributions, and as we heard, Norway basically took the lead in trying to come up with a more sustainable and predictable contribution of the C-130 as part of the MRC, and there are good reasons for this. But then in the end, I think what the report says is, I think it was ultimately welcomed by both the UN and, of course, the member states who contributed it for both technical and so military and political reasons, not least knowing when you get out, basically. Interestingly, actually, the discussions on the MRC actually started prior to the Obama summit, the leaders' summit of September 2015, but materialized in early 2016. So some of the highlights, some of the key features of the arrangement, very quickly. Well, first of all, I think the important point was the Norwegian lead in basically pulling together the different partners. There had been consultations with the UN throughout, but it was really Norway who led the sort of building the MRC partnership. Also, we heard already the key feature of the camp management, leaving the camp behind, and we know, managing a camp is not necessarily the sexiest thing for an army, for a Ministry of Defense. But clearly, we heard from all the partners who rotated thereafter their planes and their crews that it was a true added value. With the camp comes the canteen, the perimeter, of course, the lodging, etc., that Norway has been sustaining throughout, and indeed not having to pack, unpack, repack every time there's a rotation in. Then in terms of the standards and capabilities, the different countries brought slightly different models of C-130, but that did not seem to be a big issue for the mission. The issue of the rotations and the duration of the rotations is looked at in the report. We heard Norway initially was a 10-month rotation. Different partners rotated for different lengths of point. I think what comes out of the report is, from the UN standpoint, a 6 months rotation at least for each is quite essential. And you'll see that the report goes into some of the legal and financial aspects related to making the MRC happen. There is space, I think, for mainstreaming, especially the negotiation as partners with the UN, but the conclusion was that in the end, the signing of the Memorandum of Understandings and Letters of Assist, basically that allows the reimbursement of the different countries, need to be done on a bilateral basis. Then Youssef already picked up on some of the operational considerations, which was not necessarily specific to the MRC or to C-130, but we felt it was important to raise these, even though they go beyond. But the issue of the green versus white, issues of attitude and mutual understanding, and the willingness of contingents to be helpful as part of the mission, playing a key part in the capability. Then the study looks at the broader applicability of MRCs beyond planes and beyond C-130. And there, in general, it concludes that the added value of their MRCs is highest when capabilities are identical or similar, of course, when there's a longer-term commitment of all the partners, possibly with the second rotation. We've heard that this might happen and hopefully will happen for the C-130 in MINUSMA, but also where there's a significant infrastructure support element taken on by a lead country. Of course, one of the key considerations is I think it's probably more applicable to niche capabilities where the UN is not able to generate these capabilities through the traditional, I would say, fourth generation mechanism, basically one country who provides the capability over a longer period of time. We look at all kinds of other capabilities, rotary wings. I know the UN is already exploring this, I think, with a number of TCCs, possibly helicopters as part of rotational arrangements, but medical, engineering, or other aspects as well that could be explored. For sake of time, I think I will close with the last part of the report also expands into implication for fourth generation considerations. One of the key aspects that the report raises is the issue of whether the UN should be playing a greater role in matchmaking. A lot of member states, I think, would welcome this. Of course, the UN has limited capabilities to do this. It's quite actually time intensive. Even the negotiations with a number of partners as part of the MRC is time consuming. And I think in general, the lead country playing a big role in bringing the partners together, like-minded countries together, I think is still quite important. I will leave with this and then happy to discuss further after.
thank you very much, Arthur, for sharing with us these preliminary findings, and particularly thank you for resisting reading the rest of your talking points. Much appreciated. It's my pleasure now, an honor to give the floor to Major General Adrian Foster, the Deputy Military Advisor, UN Department of Peacekeeping Operations. You have the floor, General.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman and Minister, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to be here. First of all, may I start by just expressing our thanks on behalf of DPKO and the Office of Military Affairs for this, I think, what has been described as very solid, very good report. And we congratulate NUPI and IPI on it. We'd also like to thank Norway, in the presence of the Defence Minister in particular, for leading the way in these new innovative concepts, which we really do value in terms of force generation for the future. Plug and play is a consequence of some changing aspects of peacekeeping, UN peacekeeping, the increasing threat to our missions and our staff needing some new and more sophisticated responses. The broadening of the number of troop contributing countries, a very welcome development, because with it brings greater legitimacy for a force and a mission on the ground. That is useful, but not all the TCCs can have the capacity for an enduring commitment. So that has to factor into our thinking and planning in the future. The increasing drive for operational effectiveness and value for money is something else that we're feeling now, and linked to it, the need for greater operational performance by the troop contributors. Those factors are very much loom large in our mind as some of the aspects of peacekeeping change. Now, I'll leave my colleague and friend, the Force Commander Minusma, to go into maybe some of the mission specifics. But what I'd like to do is just broaden it a little bit from a DPKO OMA perspective and look at some of the ideas and challenges for MRC as far as the broader peacekeeping is concerned. Certainly the MRC for the C-130 has opened our eyes to what's possible for multinational rotations. And we agree with the NUPI report that there's potential scope for other capabilities, such as other air assets, airfield and medical capacities. Some of the issues, though, that I think we will need to take into account as we move forward. I don't spot any DFS colleague here today, but let me just recognize the point in the report about the cost effectiveness of this concept. Too many quick rotations, and people start to do their calculations and realize it's probably not as cost effective, particularly in these times of fiscal prudence to do this. So we need to look at that very carefully. Bringing together and making such a proposal happen is also a tricky one, and we thank Norway for taking such a leading role in this for the C-130s. We are doing our certainly more than our bit, I think, in the Secretariat to try and bring like-minded nations together with the same equipments to pledge in other areas and come up with similar formats. One of the challenges, though, is that sometimes there's no single nation, whilst they're interested in producing a capability, are not too interested in being the lead nation. And that is something that I think we all need to look at and address in the future. Long-term planning has been mentioned. Maybe not as essential in the past when we had traditional TCCs who were very willing, and we thank them for it, commit from the start until the end of a mission. But now we are being required. We've had to introduce that greater discipline into our planning. And hence we have a conference on next Monday and next Tuesday for Mali. pledging conference, but we're calling it Strategic Force Generation because it's going to, for the very first time, look much further out to the 4 or 5 year time frame, as opposed to the rather closer in that we've been working with in the past. And that will deal with personnel as well as equipment. And we hope to get feedback from those who attend to see whether we're heading in the right direction in that regard. Another issue is, and it's not necessarily a term I would use, but it's in the report about cultural bubbles. It talks about, and I do think we need to ensure that we recognise and avoid any them and us situations appearing in missions, and doing what we can to avoid that, because of course we're only as effective as a force as we are pulling together as one cohesive unit. And the final one in terms of the issues, well, it's not an issue. Just the report talks about the PCRS system extensively. And whilst PCRS is not necessarily designed...
Can you tell us what that is?
It's a Peacekeeping Capability Readiness System. And, am I right? The idea behind that is so that TCCs can pledge for out to some distance, and then we can take them through their levels of readiness. It's not necessarily designed for an MRC process, but it can be done if individual member states say a particular time frame they wish to pledge for. So let me, if I may, just finish by 2 personal ideas, and these are personal ideas, maybe to take this to another stage. One is on the idea of rapid deployment concept. There's more talk, there's more thinking going on in the Secretariat now and with member states about how we might be more responsive in the future. Is there potential for this, for instance, to have a number of like-minded nations with a particular capability on standby, on readiness, and they go through a rotation in terms of readiness to deploy? And then, of course, the plug and play kicks in as soon as they have deployed. I think it speaks neatly to the ideas now about even paying a premium for maintenance of equipment on high readiness that we hope to get General Assembly agreement to shortly. And the second idea would be just on role specialization or capability specialization. Does this lend itself in the future to an idea about a number of member states coming together and saying, for instance, something like CASEVAC, is this something that they want to take on and do in the future together? 2 ideas. We'd like, obviously, for them to do other things as well, but that might be something that they would want to consider. And I'm now going to please the chairman enormously because he's just given me 2-minute warning, and I'm going to finish before that time, which I think is very unusual for me. But I'd like to just finish by thanking once again NUPI and the IPI for this very good, innovative piece of work, and we look forward to continuing to work with you to see how we can take it forward in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, General. I'm grateful you beat me to it. It's my pleasure now to give the floor to our next speaker, Lieutenant Colonel Jorge Torres, Military Advisor, Permanent Mission of Portugal to the UN. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. First of all, I just want to say a few words and...
Can you bring the microphone closer to you?
Of course. To thank the Minister, Director, General Foster, General Jean-Paul, Director. It's a great pleasure to be here and share a couple of ideas and this very, very interesting concept that it was developed and that I was I had the luck to be a part of this process from the beginning. I'll try to give a little bit of the military perspective on the planning side regarding our national experience. That brings us here. that brings our C-130 that is actually deployed in Mali, and that will finish its tour, the second tour on this MCR process late this month. Since August 2014 was the year that marked our return to peacekeeping after a couple of years that we had to downgrade our presence, that we have been participating with the C-130 military transport aircraft for shorter periods, usually about 6 months on a regular basis in Mali. We mentioned before, we heard the word critical enabler. Yes, that word comes from the reason that it is an asset on high demand, either for domestic purposes, for the sustainment of other troops that we have deployed, and other international commitments. And this sometimes prevents longer-term commitments of this kind of asset. Early 2015, when we were looking at 2016 plan and engagements, I discussed with my colleague, with my Norwegian colleague, when I learned that they were thinking of employing C-130 in Mali, how to try to synchronize, because there was the gap between the deployments of this important enabler were happening. And initially, we tried to, in an informal way, try to synchronize and sequence both our commitments for the year 2016. We have been building on experiences and lessons from the previous deployments, and always try to adjust the force configuration, but always within the statement of unit requirements that the UN sets for this kind of assets. One of the examples, for instance, that we tried to build up on the initial structure was the add-on on this group of an aerial delivery team. It's a smaller team of personnel and equipment, paratroops, and other configuration assets that enables the C-130 to be able to make airdrops of cargo or equipments in the area. And this, we thought, also would enhance the capability of the mission, because it would allow, in order to make the ground movements in some critical situations, airdrop supplies, military assistance, and these kind of things. Other lessons and changes on the configuration of the force that we had done was on the aspect of medevac, something that, of course, it's very important for us all. We have to protect our own and the others, our partners, and also the ones that we are supposed to protect. And one of the things we addressed in order to improve was the pre-authorized out-of-area pre-deployments for medevac purposes, because usually when you set up, the commitment is for within the boundary of the mission. But, and if you need to go outside, you need to ask for permission for the government. So this is something that we also try to address in order to enhance and limit the time for when the situation arises. With the deteriorating security environment in Mali, to have a secured, integrated support and also operational structure, and just aside, the projection platform was and is appealing. And it fulfills the essential for any planning requirements for a force deployment. For a military planner, simplicity is important, and this model of cooperation minimizes at a very high extent the logistic deployment maneuver, making it more simple, more efficient, and more economical. Overall, I would just bring out of the lessons and all of this experience three main aspects. The first being the ability to adapt to change. The second, the innovative ways. And the third one, the win-win situations and end states. On the aspect of the ability to adapt to change, so we had a high-level threat, a very harsh weather condition environment. So the operational environment itself is difficult. And the higher the difficult, the higher the logistic demand and what we had to set up for force deployments. For instance, one aspect that is of high importance about the harsh weather and its impact, for instance, on critical enablers or special assets that require enhanced maintenance. A shorter period allows for the maintenance to be done back home and not interrupt the operational deployment. Also impacts, of course, if you are in a high-level threat environment, the force protection requirements and so forth. The ability to face the challenge, to sustain these critical gaps, enablers are always short. We never have those enough. Interoperability aspect, as it was mentioned earlier by His Excellency, addresses and makes it easier for this cooperation. Work with similar platforms, it's extensively easier to make it possible and to address also member state capability constraints, because it ensures delivery, but at the other hand, it also fulfills the UN needs. Innovative ways, other ways than the classic ways, as it was said, enhanced predictability, long-term force generation. It enables the UN to focus on other critical areas. Shorter times deployments, but at the same time more efficient. But we need flexibility because the process and the path is not easy, but we had that. Some capability, some capabilities are, we have different setups, of course, of these contributions, but very similar because the capability is the equipment plus the personnel, different configurations sometimes, but the same output. Shared capabilities. Okay, we have a multinational force and we share a lot of capabilities, not only the operational and the sustainment, even from the other parts for force protection, medical, that for instance is the other partner that allows for the whole team. And lastly, the win-win end state, to have it simple, more economic, shorter transition, because if we don't have to prepare all this logistic, it makes it easier, and the gap that the asset is not available for the mission is smaller. So in the end, more efficient use of resources and more economic for us all. For the member states that don't spend so much money, and also for the UN. In the end, for all of us. Finally, a word to Norway. Engagement, willingness, and also the capability and ability are two core values that make things done. Cooperation within partners, allies, and friends, it's easier. But the model presented here can definitely be applied to other capability forces. The path is never easy, but if you are willing, as Norway was, you'll succeed. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much for those last wise words, Lieutenant Torres. For a civilian ear, I'd like to speak to you a little bit more later on. It's my pleasure now to give the floor to our last speaker, Major General Jean-Paul de Koninck, Force Commander of the United Nations Multidimensional Integrated Stabilization Mission in Mali, MINUSMA. Welcome, sir.
Many thanks, Mr. Chairman. My Portuguese colleague kidnapped part of my time, but I will be very short. As I'm for 6 weeks now in the field, so I'm still a brand new force commander in MINUSMA. And I didn't pay a visit to the C-130 contingent over there in the field, but that is for my next tour in the field. I gave the priority to Kidal, Gao, Timbuktu, Menaka, Mopti, and so on, and the next one will be Bamako, and certainly the C-130. Excellency, many thanks for supporting the idea, the study, for initiating that concept. And many thanks also for your participation, many thanks for your providing of one C-130 in a mission, and thanks a lot to Portugal. I hope to have 2 of those assets perhaps in next rotations. Those are very valuable assets which can be used to support the mission and perhaps to shift efforts along the mission. I think we made a big step forward when it comes to operational planning. First, for myself as force commander, I don't have to think about who comes next. I have a plan. I have my plan. I don't want to go with assumptions or with hypothetical pledges. I have now a plan, a rotation plan with the C-130, and I hope to get such a plan, such a rotation plan for the helicopters. So that's perhaps the next step you could study as far as MINUSMA is concerned. So first, it's a good step forward for me as force commander. And second, I think the Prussian planning of the TCCs is also facilitated, and certainly for the small countries. And I'm speaking now as Belgium in general. The small TCCs, or the TCCs in general, can now focus on a window of opportunity. And they can choose the moment they will engage with, for instance, a C-130, in accordance with their political and military agenda. And the TCCs who engage such assets do not have to think about who comes next. Who comes next? No, it's planned. It's solved. But I know there are still issues to be solved at the UN level, like you said, financial issues, legal issues, and so on. But that's also an opportunity, I think, for UN to rethink procedures, policies, to be more flexible regarding to, let's say, modern conflicts. It's real. I think it's a real opportunity to for UN. And then this is a best practice. We have to expand that to other assets, other valuable assets. I mentioned the rotary wings for Timbuktu, Gao, Mopti, Kidal. We could think about, and you mentioned, medical level 2 hospitals, light ones. I need those assets. Let's think about ISR sensors, US, ground tracking, or perhaps more specialized assets like the WIT, weapon investigation teams, forensics, and so on. So I will go back to Bamako with some ideas. And I will perhaps come back to the MIRAT or DMIRAT with my ideas for the future, in terms of be more flexible, so that I can be more flexible with my planning. I have to adapt the mission, the concept of operations to the evolution of the threat of the environment and of the mission at the top level.
Thank you very much, General. It's amazing how much you can accomplish when, particularly in an uncertain environment, when you have on your side predictability and flexibility, and how much you can achieve when you don't care who's going to take the credit. And this is really amazing initiative that helps very much towards that objective. We have 10 minutes for question and answers. So if you could signal, and I'll ask So we have one here. Microphone, please. And John, next. Thank you, Minister. Thank you very much for coming and sharing.
Yes, it's Walter Dorn here from the Department of Field Support while on sabbatical from the Canadian Forces College. Artur, you said that camps weren't the sexiest thing, but actually one of the things that I find most fascinating about this is that the Norwegians brought in the same technology they used for camp security that they used in Afghanistan to Mali. And I can't help but feel that if we had had that same capacity in Timbuktu, then maybe the peacekeepers who died this month, the African peacekeepers, would be alive today. So what lessons can we learn from the camp security, the radars, the cameras, the sense and warn? Can we learn from this experiment for peacekeeping more generally?
Thank you very much. The microphone for John.
John Hirsch, IPI. First of all, thank you all very much for your presentations. And I thought everything you suggested that's changing and transformation is very, very valuable. One word I did not hear is the word regional. And it's widely understood that the problems in Mali are not limited to Mali. So we've had many meetings here about the Sahel, and it's been widely understood the problems in Mali cannot be resolved absent a deeper resolution of all the problems in the Sahel, drug trafficking, illegal movement of people, and so on. So here you have this large airplane that can go very far, very fast. So has there been ever any discussion about using this capacity for a broader role in bringing peace and stability to Mali over and above? I know you pointed out the really important role in Kidal, Gao, Timbuktu, but is there in the DPKO or elsewhere some consideration of a regional approach to really bring peace and stability to Mali? Thank you.
Thank you very much. One in the gentleman in the middle.
Thank you. I want to thank Norway first and foremost for putting together this plug-and-play concept.
Would you kindly tell us who you are?
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm Glenn Sadowski from the U.S. mission, one of the military advisors. It is a great concept, and I believe that it is proven true as a pilot program. And from what I've just heard from DFS and our good colleague from IPI, from the force commander himself, there's a greater need for niche and critical capabilities in Mali beyond a fixed-wing cargo airplane. So I am sorry that the Minister of Defense has left, but I was hoping to ask of Norway and others that if we have proven this concept, is there movements afoot to deliver to the United Nations critical capabilities that are outlined in the requests that they have put forward now that they have the Strategic Force Generation Capability and Planning Cell and the PCRS system? The UN is doing a great job of identifying exactly what they need. Norway has done a great job of deciding in a pilot program on how to provide it. Would they be interested in broadening this to actual capabilities that are being requested by the UN at this time? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I don't see any more questions, nor am I rushing to invite you because the time is getting short. So I'll just turn it back without further ado to the panelists for these three questions. I'll start with you, Artur.
Great. Thank you, Walter, for the question. I'm afraid we didn't look into the technicalities of the radar systems. However, I'll make two comments on the camp. There are a couple lessons on the camp front. First of all, the quality of the camp provided by Norway, the standards actually made a difference in the partners wanting to be part of the rotation. There was one lesson on the IT system for the camp that during the initial rotation, when the Portuguese contingent rotated in, actually that was a challenge because the IT technician was not no longer part of the camp management, but then Norway was able to, and you'll find this interesting as a technology geek, to remote, basically to then operate all the IT remotely from Norway from now on, so they will no longer have to fly in people every time there's a rotation. One element that was brought in, though, is that the camp management did not include a force protection component, so each of the rotation now has to bring the force protection with the plane and the crew, basically, and that was one of the thing that some of the partners raised as maybe could be an improvement in the future, the camp section of the MRC, including the force protection component. Briefly on the regional approach, I mean that's a much bigger question, but maybe trying to relate the regional aspect to the topic of the day, the C-130 and the MRC. What was interesting is that this was one of the key issues in the negotiation of MOU and LOA, whether the plane would have the ability to fly to neighboring countries. But in this context, it's primarily for logistics lines and medevac cases. MINUSMA right now is using a level 3 hospital in Dakar, so the ability of having this kind of air assets, and I'm speaking under the control of the general, to be able to fly to neighboring countries is quite important. Also, I know the UN more generally is looking at what they call the intermission cooperation concept, which is already being implemented in various missions, including from Entebbe as the regional hub, to be able to share assets, especially air assets, between different missions in the region. So there's a push towards sort of regional approaches. And regarding the niche capabilities where the countries are moving forward, I think we heard there's the helicopter discussion happening already. Again, I think the key here is back to which countries, which member states are willing to become the lead nation, even if it means to taking tasks on such as camp management beyond the initial rotation. I think that will be the test whether other lead nations come forward for other kind of capabilities in the next year or two, but I'm not well placed to answer.
Well, I come back on the first question. It's not only about physical protection within the compounds. It's about when the metallic rain comes to the compound, on the compound, and our heads, it's coming from somewhere. Those mortar shells are fired by somebody somewhere. We have to counter that. We have to avoid they can shoot, they can fire mortar shells. We have to find them. It's not only about technological protection of the camps. Second, regional. Of course, there are assets which can be shared between, let's say, UN missions in Africa, but my AOR is limited to Mali. Okay, when I have that asset, the C-130, for instance, I'm limited for its use to Mali. That's it. But perhaps we have to think about supporting the J5 Sahel, which is coming, with such an asset. That has to be studied by the UN. And then third question. This is not a fourth generation conference, but I will attend the fourth generation conference for Mali next week on Monday, and I will explain what are my needs.
Very good. Thank you. Lieutenant Colonel, you have the last word.
Thank you, Chair. On the first, regarding camp protection, indeed, Portugal is providing the team. It's a combination. The articulation we made on regard to force protection, we built up a team that is also composed with the team that provides us the security during operations with the aircraft. And it's a combination of systems that Norway had put in place, there was this. Sorry. So we are taking over the responsibility for the protection of the camp and managing the capabilities that Norway had put in place on the physical protection domain. And complementing a little bit what was said, usually according to the threat, we only protect on 2 dimensions, but the threats are evolving, and the issue of the protection on the 3rd dimension might need to come in place. On the aspect of the regional aspect, indeed is something that we sometimes discuss regarding the employment of the asset. We tried, at least on the aspect of medevac, that it's highly critical, that we would limit the time frame to get the authorization for out-of-area commitments. For the particular case of medevac situations, we already cleared which countries, so that it's no need to consult the capital for this regards. There are other aspects of cooperation, we call it intermission cooperation, that could be for logistic aspects, but would require then this authorization. It's only one military asset within then the other structures, civilian also. And on the last part, I think everything was said. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I have an entreaty here in the front. Before you came, we've agreed we will finish at 2:15. I know you've been looking at the clock, if you don't mind, because others will have to. So, very brief.
Absolutely. Only to one panel.
Okay.
And I appreciate it a lot. Thanks a lot. Matthew Lee, Intercity Press. The report looks great, but I wanted to ask the force commander of MINUSMA a question that has come up in the briefing room. We haven't gotten an answer, which is that do all contingents have access to the same equipment? I mean, safety equipment, things like there are some that said that, for example, the night vision goggles that some European contingents had weren't able to be shared with Chadian and other contingents. And it's just, I wanted to know what the issues are, if there are issues, and if they're being addressed within the mission. Thanks a lot. I appreciate it.
Just bear in mind, he just took over.
No, I understand.
The contingents are coming with their own equipment. They have to be equipped, protected, self-protected on the man. They have to be transported with vehicles, with the APCs, protected by APCs. They have to have their own night vision goggles. I don't have a bunch of equipment to equip the 12,000 people. 12,000 military working at MINUSMA. I certainly have some problems. Okay, some contingents lacking of vehicles, lacking of spare parts, lacking of individual equipment. But we have to deliver that, and I tried also to complete the basic equipment so that they are still capable to operate.
Thank you very much. Please join me in thanking the panelists for an excellent contribution.